So imagine an event that completely rewrites the rules of global power right under our noses. Today, we are diving into a really fascinating theoretical breakdown of the May 2026 Beijing summit. Now, if you thought this was just, another standard diplomatic photo op with a bunch of handshaking, well, buckle up, because the reality of what actually went down is so much more complex, and it fundamentally alters how we need to think about international relations from here on out.
Seriously, ask yourself what actually happens when $15 trillion just sits down at a single table. I mean, think about the sheer scale of that for a second. We're talking about a historic, completely unprecedented meeting where traditional world leaders didn't just meet with each other. They sat down as total equals with the top tech executives of our era, all breathing the same air, in the exact same room. $15 trillion. That is the combined market cap of the U.S. tech and finance titans that were present at this summit. You've got the leadership of Apple, Meta, Tesla, NVIDIA, BlackRock, Visa, MasterCard. The list goes on. When you gather that kind of massive wealth in one place, it proves pretty quickly that this wasn't just some standard diplomatic greeting. This was a heavily calculated concentration of economic and computational mass on foreign soil. It literally creates a gravitational pull of money and data that bends the very fabric of traditional diplomacy. And that brings us to this incredible punchy takeaway from Benoit Nouni-Lapierre's analysis. The idea that this Beijing Shadow Summit is actually updating the global resource OS. Just think about what an operating system does for your laptop, right? It manages the memory, the software, the hardware, all behind the scenes. Now, imagine that happening on a planetary scale. We are watching the quiet rewiring of a global operating system, moving way beyond those old headlines of traditional politics and, basic trade tariffs. So, to unpack this really dense geopolitical shift, here is our roadmap for the explainer. First, we'll look at the Beijing Shadow Summit itself. Second, the blurring lines between states and corporations. Third, we're going to map out the four poles of power. Fourth, we'll tackle the quantum tokenization of resources. And finally, number 5, we'll decode Africa's hidden role in this entire system. Let's get right into it. All right, part 1, the Beijing Shadow Summit and a new global alignment. We've got to ground ourselves in the actual empirical event that kicked off this whole new framework. The guest list here was just totally unprecedented. You had Presidents Donald Trump and Xi Jinping sitting right alongside corporate titans from Apple, NVIDIA, Tesla, Meta, and BlackRock. And they gathered to negotiate world-altering issues, stuff like artificial intelligence, next-gen semiconductor chips, and unprecedented market access. This definitely wasn't your granddad's statecraft. It was a functional fusion of state diplomacy and corporate platform power. Basically, it was a massive acknowledgement that nation-states alone just don't hold all the cards anymore. We really have to stop looking at the world through that old 20th century lens of simple state rivalry, where nations just fight over physical territory and draw lines on a map. That is old world statecraft. Instead, we're hurtling toward what's called algorithmic sovereignty. This is an emerging world where states, massive transnational corporations, and artificial intelligence all work together to manage tokenized resource flows. That old binary of us versus them is completely outdated, mostly because the boundaries themselves have fundamentally changed. Which leads us to part 2, blurring states and corporations. The research calls this the first collapse, where the lines between who governs and who is actually governed just totally dissolve. Now, there's a heavy, kind of academic term in the research, transjectivity. Sounds super complex, but it basically just means the dissolution of the boundary between the subject and the object. When you apply that to geopolitics, it means the absolute blurring of the boundary between a sovereign nation-state and a corporation. Tech titans aren't just operating within geopolitical constraints anymore. They are actively writing the rules of geopolitics. Just imagine that. They're acting as co-sovereigns, making supply chain decisions that literally constitute real-time state policy. The corporation isn't just a business now. It's an active layer of global governance. Because of this, you've got these CEOs essentially acting as diplomatic middleware. If you know software, you know middleware is that invisible connective tissue that lets different programs actually talk to each other. Well, when political rhetoric heats up or states start getting into severe friction, these massive corporations serve that exact same function for the physical world. They stabilize the supply chains, they keep global systems interoperable, and they basically step in exactly where traditional diplomacy hits a brick wall. Moving on to part 3, the 4 poles of power, or the quadratic structure. Let's see how this builds an entirely new map of global influence.
power isn't just a basic tug of war between two superpowers anymore. It's more like a four-legged stool holding up this new global system. The US provides the platform and financial sovereignty, so the software and the money. China supplies the industrial and infrastructural backbone, the hardware and the physical building. Africa provides the essential resources and these booming demographics, the raw material and the human pulse. And then finally, AI acts as the algorithmic governance operator. It's the invisible, mathematical hand linking all of these distinct pillars together into one functioning machine.
And this creates what the analysis calls the infrastructure compute swap. This is wild. Chinese physical hardware, we're talking vast 5G networks and deep-sea fiber optics, is seamlessly combining with highly sophisticated US AI software layers. And where is this massive synthesis primarily happening? Across African territory? It's a bizarre yet incredibly functional equilibrium where American artificial intelligence models are running flawlessly on Chinese digital infrastructure built directly into the African continent. It is this perfect, strange symbiosis.
Okay, part 4, quantum tokenization, the second collapse. This is where we tackle what might literally be the wildest concept in this whole framework: how physical assets are transforming into digital flows. Think about Schrodinger's cat. We've all heard that thought experiment, right? The cat is both alive and dead until you look in the box. Now apply that to a lump of cobalt in the ground. It's not just a rock anymore. It enters the state of superposition, where it is simultaneously a Chinese battery component, a US compute substrate, a tokenized financial instrument on Wall Street, and a local sovereign asset. It's all of these things at exactly the same time. The magic happens during the observation event. That's when an AI-driven transaction securely settles the flow and mathematically locks that cobalt into one specific unchangeable path. So, assets, they aren't just passive physical things waiting to be dug up and sold anymore. They are highly programmable, tokenized flow events managed by continuous AI valuation. And the massive takeaway here, the reason this absolutely matters for our future, is that in this new global lattice, whoever controls the digital ledger, the cryptographic standard, and the AI oracle ultimately controls the physical resource itself. Control the code, and you literally control the earth.
Finally, part 5. Africa's hidden code, the real operating system. This might be the most misunderstood pillar in the whole dynamic, but it is actually the beating heart of the system. We really need to rethink how we view an entire continent. Africa is absolutely not just a passive theater of proxy competition where larger nations play out their rivalries. Not even close. It is the indispensable computational heat sink and resource battery that anchors this entire global operating system. The research actually refers to this as the flight-to-off-row pulse. And why does that matter? Because pure algorithmic efficiency would just consume everything in its path. It desperately needs a human demographic grounding. Without Africa's distinct demographic rhythms, local cultures, and vast material resources acting as a counter-rhythm, the entire AI tokenization system would completely homogenize, overheat, and just grind to a halt. To see what this localized sovereignty actually looks like on the ground, let's zoom in on the Kenamagora compound in Sierra Leone. We're talking highly specific, very tangible defenses here. 14-foot laterite walls, a completely off-grid solar microgrid, and a self-sustaining cassava, rice, and palm caloric base. It sounds ancient, but also totally futuristic at the same time. This is literally a fortress of self-reliance, built right smack in the middle of this massive, invisible algorithmic web. And here's the so what of it all. This compound is basically its own localized observation stack. By using these off-grid, low-tech, but highly systematic approaches, the people here are purposefully collapsing those resource superpositions we talked about earlier. They are forcing the resource to retain its value, right there at the household scale. It proves that local communities can actively write their own rules to keep the value of their flows rather than instantly losing it to some global AI ledger in a split-second transaction. They aren't victims of the system, they're active, brilliant agents inside of it. So we're left with this massive, provocative question as we watch these geopolitical summits unfold. Will the future of sovereignty be determined by who actually owns the physical resources in the ground or who writes the algorithmic code that trades them in the cloud? It completely reframes the true nature of power and control in our rapidly approaching algorithmic future. Keep questioning the systems around you, and thanks so much for joining me for this explainer.